I mean, it doesn't make sense to have tariffs and be divided, and even to threaten now with additional tariffs. I mean, the crazy thing is that we can be put in the situation to use the anti-coercion mechanism for the very first time vis-à-vis the US if they put additional tariffs. Can you imagine that? This is crazy.
What happens when the world's most powerful alliance starts quietly planning for a future where it can't fully rely on its strongest member? What does it mean when America's closest allies begin preparing, not for cooperation, but for contingency? For more than 70 years, the transatlantic alliance has been the backbone of Western power. The United States provided the nuclear umbrella, the military strength, the technological infrastructure, and the financial system that underpinned global trade. Europe, in return, offered strategic alignment, political legitimacy, and one of the largest consumer markets on Earth. It wasn't always harmonious. There were trade fights, diplomatic tensions, disagreements over wars. But underneath it all, there was stability, a shared assumption that the alliance itself was solid. That assumption is now under pressure. What we're seeing today isn't the result of one dramatic speech or a single policy announcement. It's something more gradual, but arguably more significant. It's the cumulative impact of tariffs, diplomatic flare-ups, strategic uncertainty, and a growing perception in European capitals that Washington's priorities have shifted. No one in Europe is announcing a breakup with the United States. Not yet. But they are openly discussing something that would have sounded radical just a few years ago: strategic independence. The most immediate flashpoint is trade. In April 2025, Trump had slapped reciprocal tariffs on a wide range of imports from around the world, including Europe, framing them as retaliation for unfair trade practices. These measures sparked widespread alarm among allies, signaling that U.S. economic pressure could escalate unpredictably. After months of tense negotiations, Europe and the U.S. had struck a trade deal aimed at easing tariff disputes, but lingering distrust remained. Even with the agreement, allies worried that Washington's unpredictable enforcement could upend the delicate balance. After the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that President Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs were illegal under the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, many assumed that would cool tensions. Instead, the White House signaled it would pivot to other legal tools, including Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, to impose a proposed 15% global tariff. For Europe, this wasn't just a legal technicality. It was another reminder that the rules of engagement could change quickly. In response, the European Union froze the ratification process of its trade agreement with the United States. European lawmakers described the environment as volatile and unpredictable. They argued that if new tariffs were layered on top of existing most favored nation rates, it could breach previously agreed limits under the concluded trade deal. The European Union sent a clear message: agreements must be respected. A deal is a deal. And that pause? It wasn't just bureaucratic caution, it was strategic signaling. Europe is showing that it no longer wants to operate under conditions where trade policy can shift overnight. At the very same time, the EU has been accelerating efforts to diversify. It finalized a long-awaited free trade agreement with India, described by leaders on both sides as a landmark accord and the mother of all deals. The agreement will gradually reduce tariffs to near zero across most sectors, creating a market that spans roughly 2 billion people and represents about a quarter of global GDP. The symbolism is powerful. This deal comes at a moment when Washington has been deploying tariffs not only against rivals, but also against allies. India, hit with steep U.S. tariffs, has been searching for alternative partners. Europe, facing its own tariff uncertainty, found common ground with New Delhi. When the European Union sealed its massive trade deal with India, Washington moved fast. The U.S. announced its own agreement with New Delhi, trimming certain tariffs and highlighting expanded purchases of American goods. On the surface, it looked like classic geopolitical one-upmanship, the United States signaling that it wouldn't be outpaced or outmaneuvered. But here's the bigger story. For decades, America's allies typically coordinated major economic moves with Washington. There was an assumption, sometimes explicit, sometimes unspoken, that the U.S. set the pace. That assumption is fading. Europe didn't wait. It negotiated, it signed, and it moved on. And India was just the beginning. Beyond that headline-grabbing deal, the European Union has been quietly accelerating a much broader trade diversification strategy. The goal is simple, even if it's not always stated bluntly: reduce over-reliance on any single partner, especially one that's seen as politically volatile. In early 2026, that strategy reached a major milestone. After more than 25 years of on and off negotiations, the EU formally signed a sweeping trade agreement with the Mercosur bloc in South America. This isn't a minor adjustment around the edges of global trade. It creates one of the largest free trade zones in the world. The deal eliminates tariffs on more than 90% of traded goods. For Europe, that means a significant boost for exports like machinery, automobiles, and industrial equipment. For Mercosur countries, it means expanded access to European markets for agricultural products. But it's not a blank check. The agreement includes safeguards for European farmers and stronger sustainability commitments, especially addressing long-standing concerns about deforestation in South America. The symbolism matters here. This deal was in negotiations for a quarter of a century, and it was finalized at a moment when transatlantic trade relations were under strain. That timing is not accidental. And it doesn't stop there. The European Union also concluded a free trade agreement with Indonesia after more than 9 years of talks. It revamped its trade framework with Mexico. It revived stalled negotiations with Australia. Across continents, Latin America, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, Europe is widening its network. This flurry of activity reflects a deliberate strategy. Europe is building redundancy into its economic relationships, not decoupling from the United States, not severing ties, but making sure that if trade tensions flare up again, it has alternatives. And this shift doesn't end with trade. It extends into the heart of European security. For more than 70 years, NATO's Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause, and the American nuclear umbrella have formed the backbone of Europe's defense architecture. Most European countries do not possess nuclear weapons. They rely on the United States. Around 100 American nuclear bombs are stationed across several European countries under NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement, with Allied air forces trained to deploy them if necessary. That structure has long been seen as the ultimate guarantee. But doubts have crept in. President Donald Trump's rhetorical posture toward Russia in the context of the Ukraine war, his transactional framing of alliances, and even territorial rhetoric involving Greenland have unsettled European capitals. Leaders are asking quiet but serious questions. What if American political winds shift again? What if commitments become conditional? At the Munich Security Conference, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz confirmed that Berlin has been holding confidential discussions with France about European nuclear deterrence. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer emphasized enhanced nuclear cooperation with Paris, a conversation that was once considered almost taboo. Expanding a European nuclear role has entered the mainstream. France, alongside the United Kingdom, is one of Europe's 2 nuclear powers. It maintains roughly 290 warheads and spends about 5.6 billion euros annually to sustain its arsenal. President Emmanuel Macron is preparing to update France's nuclear doctrine, clarifying what Paris can offer European partners, while firmly maintaining that ultimate launch authority remains exclusively French. No one is seriously proposing to replace the American umbrella overnight. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has stressed that the United States remains the ultimate guarantor. But the fact that alternatives are now openly debated tells you something profound has changed. A recent report presented at the Munich Security Conference laid out 5 possible nuclear pathways for Europe and warned that none are easy or inexpensive. Its core message was blunt: the era of strategic complacency is over. Now, when we talk about European defense autonomy, it's easy to focus only on nuclear weapons. That's the dramatic part. But the shift runs much deeper than that. For years, the European Union had its own mutual defense clause, Article 42.7, sitting quietly in the background, largely overshadowed by NATO's Article 5. NATO was the real shield. The United States was the backbone. That was the assumption. But that assumption is being revisited. At a recent meeting in Zagreb, conservative European leaders openly discussed strengthening the EU's own defense structures. They tasked officials with developing more robust military command systems within the European Union itself. That's significant. It signals that Europe isn't just talking about autonomy in theory, it's starting to think about the infrastructure that would make it possible. Then there's the money. The EU has launched a €150 billion defense investment program, and it comes with a notable condition. No more than 35% of the components in funded projects can come from outside the EU and partner states like Norway and Ukraine. The United States is not considered a partner under this framework, meaning American defense firms could be excluded from large portions of EU-funded contracts, limiting U.S. market access and weakening its long-held dominance in supplying Europe's military capabilities. That's a big shift. The idea of Buy European is gaining real momentum, even in countries that once resisted protectionist defense policies. Governments are openly discussing how to reduce reliance on American surveillance systems, intelligence enablers, and missile defense technologies. This doesn't mean Europe can unplug from U.S. systems tomorrow. It can't. American capabilities remain deeply embedded in Europe's security architecture. But politically, the mood has clearly changed. Technology is another front in this quiet recalibration. Across Europe, governments are reassessing their dependence on American platforms, whether it's Google, Meta, Zoom, or Microsoft Teams. France is preparing to ban public officials from using US-based video conferencing tools, shifting instead to a domestic alternative called Visio, built on infrastructure provided by the French firm Outscale. Germany is exploring European substitutes for American data analysis software. In the Netherlands, lawmakers are reviewing whether to block the acquisition of a sensitive state identity verification system by a U.S. company. In the European Parliament, some members are urging leadership to phase out American software and hardware altogether. A new European social media platform has even launched, positioning itself as a homegrown alternative to platforms like X, with data hosted exclusively on European servers. Officials prefer the word de-risking over decoupling. They're careful about the language, but the impulse is clear. Europe wants sovereignty over critical technologies. It doesn't want to be in a position where access to essential digital infrastructure depends on decisions made in Washington. And that brings us to the anxiety beneath all of this. European policymakers have openly discussed worst-case scenarios, including the possibility of a U.S. executive order that could restrict access to data centers, cloud services, or key software. That may sound extreme, but the fact that it's being considered tells you how much trust has eroded. Energy tells a similar story. The United States now supplies more than a quarter of Europe's gas, a share likely to grow as Russian imports are phased out. But European leaders are wary of simply swapping one dependency for another. After tensions flared over Greenland, EU Energy Commissioner Dan Jorgensen described the episode as a wake-up call. Europe is now deepening energy partnerships with Canada, Qatar, and North African suppliers like Algeria to diversify. Even finance isn't immune. European lawmakers have raised concerns about reliance on U.S. payment giants like MasterCard and Visa. The European Central Bank is preparing a digital euro, scheduled for launch in 2029, designed to provide a sovereign, pan-European payment system. And in Germany, some politicians are questioning why over 1,000 tons of national gold reserves remain stored at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, arguing that unpredictability in U.S. policy warrants rethinking old assumptions. It's also no secret that diplomacy has become another source of friction. Over the past year, several American ambassadors in Europe have landed in hot water for wading into domestic politics. Take Belgium, for instance. U.S. Ambassador Bill White sparked controversy by accusing the country of anti-Semitism related to a judicial investigation. He even threatened visa restrictions against a Belgian political figure. That raised eyebrows in Brussels, to say the least. Across the Channel in France, the situation wasn't any calmer. Ambassador Charles Kushner didn't show up when summoned over comments about the killing of a French activist. Paris responded by temporarily restricting his access to government ministers. And in Poland, the U.S. envoy publicly cut ties with the parliamentary speaker over political remarks. Now, these incidents aren't just isolated missteps. They're fueling the perception of a more confrontational American diplomatic posture. European officials are noting a deterioration in verbal tensions with a host of allies, including Canada, Denmark, Belgium, Japan, Ireland, New Zealand, and France. It's a pattern that can't be ignored. But let's be clear. Europe isn't suddenly severing ties with the United States. The U.S. is still the EU's largest trading partner, and the continent's security architecture continues to lean heavily on American capabilities. Analysts caution that Europe can't afford a clean break. What we're seeing is more of a recalibration, a strategic hedge rather than a full decoupling. European leaders are pursuing what they call de-risking. They're widening trade networks, investing in domestic defense production, nurturing homegrown tech platforms, and exploring alternative energy partnerships. The goal? To ensure that if Washington turns inward or becomes erratic, Europe won't be left exposed. Even in areas where cooperation continues, the tone has shifted. European officials are speaking about Team Europe and emphasizing unity, mutual respect, and trust. Sovereignty and competitiveness are front and center. The irony here is sharp. The very strategy the U.S. uses to strengthen its leverage through tariffs, hard-edged diplomacy, and pressure is inadvertently nudging Europe toward greater autonomy. The transatlantic relationship has weathered rocky patches before, and it may survive this one too. But something fundamental has shifted. Europe is no longer assuming American guarantees are immutable. It's planning for contingencies, methodically and deliberately reducing dependence on the United States. And here's the key takeaway. The real question isn't whether Europe is turning away from America. The deeper question is whether U.S. unpredictability and pressure have pushed its allies to imagine a future where loyalty doesn't come at the expense of autonomy. At the 2026 Munich Security Conference, European leaders openly called out Washington, labeling it increasingly unreliable. The U.S. response left the entire audience stunned. What did the Europeans declare? And how did America react? Watch this video to find out.